Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched WandaVision episode 6. Let's talk about it. So episode 6 of WandaVision picks up right where we left off in episode 5 after that huge bombastic cliffhanger where it was revealed that Quicksilver from the X-Men films is all of a sudden making an appearance in this MCU series for some inexplicable reason. And as Darcy said, it seems as though that Wanda has recast Pietro. But of course, we discussed in my previous review of the series that I don't believe that to be the case. I think there's something afoot here, okay? And there are many theories surrounding who the character of Pietro is and what his purpose is in this world, which we will be exploring further in this review because we got a lot more information this time around. So I'm super excited to dive into this episode because overall it was, as per usual, jam-packed with a ton of information, a ton of indicators for where the series may be going in the next 3 episodes that we have left, and of course a ton of references to the previous MCU films, which I always love to dig into in these reviews. But before we dive into my thoughts on this episode for WandaVision, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into this one. First off, just like with the previous episodes, this time around we jumped another decade from the 80s to the 90s. Now this is an era that I can say I am more familiar with for sure. Very much so. I very much grew up in the early 2000s, so I wasn't quite as familiar with the sitcoms that were explored in the previous eras in this series. But as soon as I heard that opening sequence, as soon as I heard that theme song, I already knew what that reference point was. For the first time ever, I was able to say, yes, I got that reference when it came to the type of sitcom that was explored in this episode, because of course it was Malcolm in the Middle. Are you kidding me? I had the biggest crush on Frankie Muniz growing up, so I was like, whoa, this is just this is crazy. This is bringing back so many memories. Now I actually got a sense of what it must have felt like for people who were familiar with the other sitcoms to see them being played out in the MCU, because it was like, it was trippy, it was crazy, and I loved to see it. It was so bizarre. And especially this kind of sitcom where there was a lot of fourth wall breaking, there was a lot of weird camera angles. For the first time we got these really close-up shots of, you know, Vision, for example, then you have Wanda in the background, but the camera is focused on both of them. It's such an interesting choice to be inspired by Malcolm in the Middle, especially because this time around, at least at the beginning, this episode was kind of exploring the world and the life of Wanda and Vision and their home through the perspective of Billy and Tommy, which is much like Malcolm in the Middle, the series, where we're looking at, you know, their situation and their lives through the perspective of the kids as opposed to the adults, which we saw in, you know, previous sitcoms that the series was inspired by. So I like this little update to see Billy and Tommy kind of going through their ordinary lives in the opening sequence, with Wanda brushing her teeth and using her powers to close the door, and Vision kind of going through the sofa with his powers to kind of chase them. It was a really nice reference point to have, because for the first time we're able to see what it's like to live in this fictional dimension world through the perspective of the twins. And what was really interesting is that we're actually introduced to the character of Uncle Pietro, not through Wanda or Vision, but rather through the twins themselves, and we're able to see their perspective and their thoughts on this character first and foremost. And it seems as though from the beginning of the series that actually Tommy, who seems to be more connected to Quicksilver, to Pietro, because of the similarities in their powers and also just a natural affinity to him, he seems to really like Pietro. He seems to connect with him automatically. They get along so well. But it seems as though Billy is the one who is a little bit more hesitant towards him. Tommy mocks Billy at the beginning, saying that, you know, he's afraid of Pietro because he thinks he's a vampire or whatever. But I think I think Billy may have this kind of sixth sense, if you will, okay? He may have a little bit of an instinct to him because of his powers, which are more directly linked to Wanda's powers, and he seems to be able to sense that something is off in Pietro in a way that Tommy isn't able to, because his powers don't align in that way. So I find that very interesting that from the get-go, we're able to see two different perspectives on the character of Uncle Pietro through the twins. Now, since we're already on the topic of Uncle Pietro, let's start off by diving into his role in this episode because it was very interesting. It was very interesting. First of all, Evan Peters was acting the hell out of this role, acting the hell out of the entire episode. The fact that he was able to, first of all, mingle and become friends with his nephews so seamlessly, playing the role of this wacky uncle who just comes in, he pops by, disturbs the peace a little bit, and the kids find him to be so cool and so exciting, especially in the case of Tommy, who has similar powers to him, as we find out later on. I mean, he just played that role so well, whilst at the same time having this just undercurrent of sinisterness, this undercurrent of untrustworthiness. It was so excellent. There are scenes where you can just see from his performance, he's not doing much, but he's doing just enough to raise suspicion. And I think he was excellent in this role. And the fact that we got to see him in the MCU playing whatever role that he ends up actually playing, again, like I said in my review last week, it's just such a joy because I'm such a huge fan. But at the beginning of the episode, we see Pietro and Tommy changing into a Halloween costume because it is in fact Halloween, and this costume is of course heavily inspired by the actual Quicksilver from the Marvel comics, so that was a nice little touch that they had there. Not to mention, I couldn't help but notice that Pietro's hair bears some sort of resemblance to devil horns, but I don't know, maybe that's just a coincidence, right? But anyways, I do think it was really interesting to see Tommy and Pietro both dressed as Quicksilver. Of course, we already know that Pietro himself is Quicksilver, but it kind of added a layer of, foreshadowing for Tommy's case, because it was basically telling us that his powers would very much resemble Pietro's. And in fact, we got a bit of a hint of that earlier on in the episode where they had this kind of flashback that was very Malcolm in the Middle, and we saw them playing on these dance mats, and Tommy seemed so much faster than his brother, and I think that was a kind of inkling of what his powers would end up being. But what I find really interesting about the character of Pietro is that, after the huge shock that happened at the end of episode 5 of him just popping up out of nowhere and Wanda seeming genuinely surprised and genuinely shocked by his appearance, it seems as though she's not yet put at ease. It seems as though she is very much still suspicious of the circumstances by which Pietro suddenly popped up into her life, and she seems to be trying to kind of prod him by asking him questions that are specifically related to their backstory, their childhood, things that he should know, which tells me personally that she did not have anything to do with his sudden appearance in this world. I think external forces were in play when it comes to Pietro popping up out of nowhere. She wasn't the one who did this, and she even said as much in the previous episode. But I find it interesting how at the beginning of the episode, when they're interacting for the first time in this episode, we see Pietro kind of mention this Sokovian Halloween story where he was dressed up as Nick Fury, apparently. I don't know how that works, but that was a fun little gag there. And also seeing the Sokovian Halloween be so miserable. It was such a stereotype of Eastern European culture, but the Sokovian Halloween looked like it absolutely sucked. Anyway, but I think it was really interesting because even at that point, Wanda was like, I don't remember it the way that you just said. I don't think that what you just said is accurate. So already red flags were being raised in her mind, but she's quickly distracted by the entrance of Vision, who again, he seems to not be fully committed to this whole role anymore because he knows the truth of what's going on, and it's not quite leaving his head, the fact that Wanda is controlling this entire town. He's not okay with it, but he sometimes wants to play along because he sees he's trying to measure the best way forward when it comes to this very delicate situation, and rightfully so. So at the beginning where she compliments his costume, he even says well, I didn't have anything else in my closet, what did you want me to wear? What were you expecting me to pop out with if you didn't give me any other options? Because you're controlling everything. Clearly you wanted me to wear this. But then he quickly covers up and he quickly plays along and starts talking about Mexican wrestlers or something, and they're flirting with each other, and it's all well and good until he very slyly slips in that he's actually going to be hanging out with a neighborhood watch because it's Halloween and danger and whatnot, even though this is an idealized world, but whatever. He's going to be hanging out with a neighborhood watch instead of going trick-or-treating with his family, which upsets Wanda, and she almost slips out that this is not what he was supposed to be doing. But of course, because they're treading on very delicate ground here, no one wants to upset the peace, so they're just going along with it as best as they can, even though they know that that there's trouble in paradise, and also so do their children. But we're going to be talking about Vision's little adventures during this episode later on. But first up, back to Quicksilver and his sister. I found it to be really interesting, really fascinating to see the way that they interacted with one another. I think it didn't feel as, close and as genuine, because Wanda was kind of tiptoeing around him. She never really felt like she was, fully comfortable around him. She seemed like she was a bit more on edge. It was so different to the Wanda that we were introduced to in the first episode, who was so at ease in her world, the world that she created, as we later found out, and how happy and how joyous and in harmony she was with Vision. But now it seems as though she's very much on edge, because not only is she aware that Vision is suspicious of her and they've had their issues after he found out exactly what's been going on in this neighborhood, but also now she's suspicious of Pietro. So it seems as though all of these threats are surrounding her, and she doesn't seem quite as ease with anyone apart from her own children. So we do see them go out into the neighborhood and they're trick-or-treating, I guess, during the day. But what's very interesting to see is that there are kids everywhere. There are kids dressed up in various Halloween costumes, some of which may bear resemblance to some Disney characters. If you look closely, I did spot a Princess Jasmine, I believe, which was fun. But there are kids all over the place. And it seems to me that Wanda did heed Vision's observation in the last episode, where he mentioned that he never sees kids around in Westview. So she fixed that promptly. She fixed that, and in order to kind of keep up this illusion as well as flesh out the world that she's been building, she did employ some children to act the roles that she needed them to, and also I guess to kind of provide some company for her kids as well, maybe, because it would have been weird for them to kind of go around trick-or-treating on their own and not spot any other kids doing so as well. But it's during this scene outside in the neighborhood that we do get Wanda's first test of Pietro, where she tries to get him to remember a certain child that they knew when they were kids themselves, but he completely dodges the question. He completely dodges the question, and he does the same thing near the end of the episode where she asks him about his accent. He doesn't answer any of the questions that she presents to him, which tells me that he is sus as hell. But we already knew that. We already knew he was sus. But after that little scene between them where clearly Wanda's question went unanswered, she did have that moment where she referenced Kick-Ass. She said Kick-Ass, which is of course a reference to the film Kick-Ass, which Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Evan Peters both starred in. I still think, like I said in my previous review, that Evan Peters was the better Quicksilver. Like, no tea, no shade, but he was. Like, he actually was, and I'm very happy to see him in the MCU. But we'll see if Aaron Taylor-Johnson's version of the character does pop up sometime around at the end of this series. And the final point on Pietro that I did want to mention is that I couldn't help but notice that not only is he dodging Wanda's questions with a quickness, but also he seems to want to get in between Vision and Wanda. It seems to me as though he's trying to get Wanda on her own, in her own little corner, so that he can manipulate her. Whatever character he's actually portraying, whether it be Nightmare, Mephisto, Grim Reaper, listen, there have been all types of theories about who he actually is, but whoever he actually is, he is interested in Wanda and Wanda alone, which is very interesting when we are going to be discussing the role of Vision and the role of Hayward. Hayward. We're going to be talking about Hayward later on, and it seems as though that there is a huge difference between what Hayward is motivated by and who he wants out of this dome versus whoever Pietro actually is wants from the dome, which is clearly Wanda or her children. And we see this at the beginning of the episode where, like I said, Wanda and Vision have that tense moment where he says that he's not going to be joining the family for their trick-or-treating, and that upsets Wanda, but Pietro kind of slides in seamlessly like a little snail, and he acts as a kind of mediator between them, except he's very dismissive of Vision. He's like, yeah, we don't need Vision. I could be the father figure for the kids for the day. Like, I have an XY chromosome. It doesn't matter. We don't need him. He seems to be very dismissive of Vision until, of course, at the end of the episode where he takes it a step too far. He takes it a step too far and asks Wanda, but it's not as if your husband can die twice, right? Well, she freaks out at that reaction and she just pushes him to the side, pushes him right to the side. That was such a shocking moment, especially because at this time she believes to some extent that this is her brother. So the fact that she reacted in that way was quite dramatic, quite visceral. But it seems as though whoever Pietro actually is trying to push, is trying to drive this wedge between Wanda and Vision. And he's been able to successfully do so to some extent, but there is a limit. But it seems as though that Pietro not only wants to get closer to Wanda and drive Vision out of the way from her, but also from the children, from the twins, because it seems as though for the majority of at least the first half of the episode, he's only interested in them. He is taking his time to be the wacky, playful uncle with them, but mostly it seems as though he wants to have a bigger influence on them, which is interesting. And of course, we have to remember that at the very beginning of this series, it was established that this town is for the children, that a lot of what is happening in this town is happening for the children. And of course, it was discovered that those kids were Tommy and Billy, because there were literally no other kids around until this episode. And speaking of the twins themselves, let's go through their journey this episode, because I found that to be really, really interesting. So first off, we are introduced to their powers this episode, and as I already said, Tommy is shown to have his super speed, as it was predicted by, Vision's super speed, but also Quicksilver's super speed. And going back to the Vision thing, I mentioned in my review of episode 3 or something, I've lost track. I've lost track, but I did say that it was a bit weird that they kind of ham-fisted in the idea that Vision had super speed, which we had never previously seen in the MCU, only to kind of emphasize the similarities between Quicksilver and Tommy. Like, why couldn't it be sufficient that Quicksilver and Tommy had that similarity? Why did it need to be established that Vision also had super speed? I still don't quite understand that, especially because we're not insinuating that they're biologically related in like a natural way. So it's not as if they have Vision's DNA, or I don't know. I don't know what they're trying to do with that, but either way, I don't know why it was necessary to kind of ham-fist that idea in, that Vision has his super speed, but I digress. Anyways, we do establish in this episode that Tommy does get his superpowers, and later on it is also established that Billy has superpowers, but this time around they resemble more to his mother's powers. He seems to have some sort of telekinesis. He seems to be able to sense things and hear things from huge distances, which comes in very handy after what we see happen at the end of this episode. But overall, I do think that it's very interesting to see how quickly things are moving. These kids at this point are still 10 years old, I believe. So for their powers to already be manifesting shows just how powerful they are. And I think that is a huge motivator for Pietro, whoever Pietro actually is, to get closer to them and try and influence them at a young age. Now, on the topic of the twins and Pietro's possible influence over them, we have to talk about this week's ad, because this week's ad was freaky and creepy and eerie as hell. This week's ad was just a perfect representation of a kids focused ad that we would see in the 90s and the early 2000s, with that kind of claymation animation that's happening there and these wacky characters selling these, kids snacks. Except this time around we see this shark coming up, and correct me if I'm mistaken, correct me if I've gone insane in quarantine, but it seems as though that shark is voiced by Evan Peters, right? Like, that shark is voiced by Evan Peters. Am I crazy, or do they sound exactly the same? And this shark, funnily enough, is selling this snack, this kind of yogurt or something that's called Your Magic, right? He pops up from the sea, starts selling this snack called Your Magic. He starts saying that once upon a time, I used to be starving, I used to be so hungry, but then I started snacking on Your Magic. It's such a direct reference, it's such a direct address, and I feel like this ad is essentially telling us that whatever entity Pietro actually is trying to feed off of someone's magic. It's very clear. It's very clear to me that it's trying to feed off of someone's magic, but it seems as though that the kid who's on this small island who eventually becomes starved, he seems to represent the character of Billy. At first I thought it might be the character of Wanda because she also wears red, but I feel like because it is a boy, essentially I think it's more likely to be Billy because he also wears red just like his mother. So it seems as though this ad is a representation of this shark, whatever entity Pietro actually is, because make no mistake, that is not Pietro. Whatever entity he actually is trying to feed off of Billy's magic, which I find fascinating. And again, it goes back to my theory that he's trying to have influence over the twins so that he can eventually control them in some way, because he's aware of how powerful they are and perhaps even how much more powerful they can become. But if it is true and the kid that's depicted in this ad is actually Billy, then the fate that awaits him, as we see depicted depicted in the ad is pretty scary and pretty terrifying and quite tragic because we see this child waste away. He's not able to open his, yogurt, his snack, which is actually his magic. He's not able to open it up, and so he ends up wasting away, which is really interesting. I wonder what that means. Like, if he doesn't kind of tap into his magic, he's not going to be able to thrive, or he won't be able to survive. Or maybe it's because the shark has already eaten all of his magic. He's already sucked out the magic that Billy has, so maybe that's why he's dying. I'm not quite sure what the meaning was there, but there's definitely something to do with this shark character, who I feel like is voiced by Evan Peters, and this shark character kind of trying to suck out the magic in Billy, and whether or not he's able to tap into his magic and save himself, that's left to be determined for the rest of this series. Next up, we have Vision. Now, we see Vision go off on his own little side quest this episode. He goes off on a different path after telling his wife that he's going to be joining the Neighbourhood Watch and, patrolling the neighborhood in this idyllic world that Wanda has created. Again, this doesn't make sense, but whatever. That's the story that he's come up with, even though Herb outed him, but we're going to talk about that right now. So he ends up going on this side quest to try and find out, Wanda's influence on Westview and how far it stretches. And he ends up going to the kind of outskirts of this neighborhood where things become more and more barren. It seems as though there's less detail to the world in this area, and this was really interesting to me because I remember mentioning in my review of some episode, I don't know, the weeks are blending in together, but I remember mentioning in one of those reviews that it seems as though that as the episodes went on and as the decades went on in television, the world got more and more complex. Westview has become a very complex place. It's no longer just, Wanda and Vision's living room and, Vision's office. Now it's, a whole town. It's a whole town with its own square and these other houses, and you have more people joining Westview, which is very interesting. So it seems to me that Wanda is kind of channeling more and more power as she goes on to kind of flesh out this world and make it a little bit more detailed, a little bit more realistic. But at the same time, there seems to be a limit to her power, where at the outskirts of the neighborhood, she's not able to maintain the same amount of detail. So when Vision ventures off into the unknown, where he sees this neighborhood that is just so dark and creepy, it seems abandoned, but people are still kind of carrying out their activities the way that they would if they were closer to Wanda in Westview. But then you have this woman who's kind of stuck in this loop, like she's a non-playable character in a video game. And actually, my brother did say that it kind of resembled a video game where you're creating this world, but sometimes you're not able to maintain the same level of detail because it would take up so much more bandwidth. And it seems to me that's exactly what's happening here, where Wanda has a certain amount of bandwidth and she's not able to kind of flesh out the world equally overall. So there are places where it seems barren and not as detailed, like I said. But we do get this shot where Vision starts to fly and he is able to get a bird's eye view of Westview. And honestly, it is shocking to see how much more detailed, how much more lively it has become. I mean, it feels close to a metropolitan city at this point. Like, it is becoming so much more complex and there's so much more world building going on in that dome. If everything that Vision sees within that dome is actually there, like, that is incredible. That is an incredible amount of power that Wanda is channeling into this world. But he does end up seeing the other side, the kind of edge of the dome, where he spots a car, and this car seems to want to leave, but it's kind of stuck, just like the other characters in this side of Westview. He heads over to the car, and lo and behold, we have Agnes. Now, Vision's interaction with Agnes is very, very interesting because we learn a few things when it comes to Agnes and what she knows of the world, and also the role that she's playing in Westview, because I've just been going back and forth at this point. There have been times where I feel like Agnes is working with the big bad, that she's evil, she must be in cahoots with whoever actually wants Wanda to be stuck in Westview and to kind of channel her powers into this dimension. Then there are also scenes where it seems as though she's genuinely afraid. As we saw in episode 3, where she was talking to Herb, she seemed as though she was genuinely afraid for Vision to find out what was actually going on, and that's why she stopped Herb. And then, of course, we got this scene where she's in her car. It seems as though she was trying to escape, but she's been stopped by, the powers of Wanda or of someone, and she hasn't been able to escape. So she's just kind of sitting there static until Vision interacts with her, and he kind of touches her head again because he's able to access her real thoughts that way, as we saw in the previous episode. Except this time around, she sees Vision and she thinks they're saved. It seems as though for a second she sees Vision as a sign of hope, hope, because she even says, like, you're an Avenger, wow. But Vision's like, oh my god, like, I am Vision, but I don't know what the Avengers are. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So clearly Vision has suffered from some sort of amnesia when it comes to his previous life, and he already hinted at this in episode 5, where he was shouting at Wanda, telling her that he was afraid because he doesn't even remember anything about his existence prior to the existence that she created for him. But then Agnes goes one step further, because she starts to freak out thinking that she's dead, and Vision asks her, well, why would you think that you're dead? Like, why is that the first thing that came to your mind? And she tells him, because you are. Because you're dead. So if we're on the same plane of existence, my guy, that means I'm dead too, and that is very worrying. And Vision's freaking out, like, what do you mean dead? Like, what's going on? And she just starts repeating dead, dead, in this like creepy way, and she starts cackling like a witch, and clearly she's not in her right mind, until Vision kind of taps her head again and kind of sends her back into her trance, and she ends up taking that U-turn and going straight back into Westview, where she belongs, or at least in Wanda's opinion. So that was a really interesting interaction there, because now I'm not sure where Agnes actually stands in this story. The character of Agnes is so obscure, she's so interesting, because it seems as though in each episode we have an idea of who she actually is and what her actual purpose is, but every single time that seems to be turned around. But Vision doesn't stop there. We do see him reach Ellis Avenue, which is the place that Wanda told her kids not to go up to. That's clearly the kind of barrier that has been set up, at least at this point in time in the show. But he reaches Ellis Avenue and eventually tries to breach that barrier, the barrier of the hex, and it is the most brutal scene that we've ever seen Vision go through. I mean, we've seen this guy have a whole mind stone snatched out of his forehead, but somehow seeing him try to breach the hex was so much more excruciating, because it was more prolonged. At least when Thanos killed him, it was like a sudden, quick thing. But when it comes to him trying to go through this hex, it was like the most painful thing. It actually reminded me of Captain America Civil War, where Wanda was using her powers to increase his density and forcing him through the ground. Like, it seemed as though it was taking that much more energy for him to go through this hex, and it was taking literally every single molecule out of him with the resistance that he was going through. And that's really interesting, because we've seen 3 people kind of breach that hex at this point in time. We've seen, of course, Geraldine, aka Monica, be yeeted out. We've seen Wanda herself walk out of there, no problem. And now we've seen Vision struggle out of there. And it seems to me that in the case of Monica, she had no issue breaching that hex because Wanda wanted her out of there ASAP. Whereas with the case of Vision, she wants to keep him there. He's like the most, well, one of the most precious things to her when it comes to their world in Westview. So it makes sense that it would be so hard for him to leave. But we do see him leave the hex entirely, but he is just all shredded up. He is completely destroyed. This guy who is made up of vibranium. Vibranium is completely destroyed. And that's when his son, Billy, gets this kind of sense, is able to kind of get this telekinetic connection with Vision. And he warns his mother that Vision is in danger. And that's when she takes the drastic measures of increasing the size of the hex, just as Jimmy Woo had predicted in episode 4, where he said, okay, theoretically this thing could get bigger. That's exactly what happened, which is again shocking, because we already see that there's somewhat of a limit to her powers, especially in the edges of the world. But the fact that in that moment she says, F it, we're gonna make it bigger. And she encapsulates a ton of the sword base, creating these weird and wacky characters out of the sword agents, and actually creating a circus out of the sword base, which is funny because it's kind of like a play on the idea that it's a circus. She doesn't take it seriously. But after making the hex bigger, she seems to be able to cover Vision again, so he seems to have been able to heal under her powers. Now because it seems as though Vision will be able to heal, I wouldn't be surprised if next episode someone managed to tell Vision exactly who he is, the life that he lived before he was married to Wanda and he moved to Westview with her. And I wouldn't be surprised if that person ends up being Darcy, who we see at the very end also gets sucked into Wanda's hex. I wouldn't be surprised if Darcy is the one who kind of explains everything to him, and that's how he's able to kind of get on the same page with everyone in terms of what's really going on here. So speaking of the sword agents, now let's talk about Hayward. Now let's talk about Hayward and how much of a dickhead he is. Listen, I said this in my review last week, did I not? He's a dickhead. Darcy even called it as well herself, and she was right. And not only is he a dickhead, because he already was in last week's episode, but he's like actual trash as well this time around. Like, he's literally a whole hot pile of garbage this time around. It seems as though he just said F it to all pretenses, and in this episode decided to become a literal mustache twisting evil person, because he literally kicks out Monica from the force, from the operation, I guess. And I suspected in last week's episode that he wanted Monica out of the way from the beginning, but he hadn't anticipated that this whole situation, this missing persons case, would become so serious, and that's why he's kind of taking control of everything. But I suspected that he wanted Monica out of the way from the get-go because of his true motivations when it comes to Vision, because he fully just wants Vision. And I did mention earlier this kind of parallel that exists between the entity that Pietro actually is versus Hayward, and how there's this kind of clash where Pietro clearly just wants Wanda and her kids. And this is further proven, of course, when we see that Hayward has been tracking not Wanda, but Vision specifically. He wants Vision. Okay, he doesn't care about everyone else. He literally just wants Vision. And as I said in my review last week, I think it's because he's doing that classic Nick Fury thing where he's trying to build weapons secretly. Remember how Nick Fury wanted to build weapons using the Tesseract in the first Avengers? I think the same thing is happening here. He wants to build weapons using Vision. And it's very interesting because in last week's episode, he said that in Vision's living will, I don't know when he had time to do that, but in his living will, he didn't want to be used as a weapon. He stated that very clearly, but clearly Hayward is not interested in Vision's actual desires and actually following through with what Vision wanted. He is 100% trying to use Vision as a weapon nonetheless. Unfortunately, even though it would have been so satisfying to see Hayward punished for his actions and ending up inside of the hex at the end of the episode, he does manage to narrowly escape in his car, and so we will be finding out, you know, what's going on with him and his operation later on in this series. It doesn't seem as though he will be affected by Wanda's trance because he hasn't been pulled into the hex like most of the Sword team have. And finally, let's talk about our favorite trio, Monica, Darcy and Jimmy. Now, like I said, Darcy at the very end of the episode does unfortunately end up getting sucked into the hex, although it's not quite unfortunate though, because I do think she will be playing a huge role in informing Vision of what exactly is going on. But interestingly enough, after the gang were kicked out of Sword, or this operation, I'm not quite sure what happened there, Darcy was able to hack. Listen, I don't know when she became a hacker. Okay, we're just gonna go with the flow. But Darcy was able to hack her way into some classified files where she, one, was able to find out about the whole Hayward wanting Vision situation, but two, was also able to view Monica's blood tests and her medical records, where it seems as though, as I said in my review, that Monica's blood and her biology has been altered by Wanda on a molecular level. She is changing, and it seems as though that her powers are going to be manifesting from these changes. Also, it seems as though that the transformation hasn't quite completed yet. I think that's what they're insinuating. I think it's going to take her going through the boundary at least one more time before her powers actually manifest. But what's really interesting is that Monica was planning on going back in nonetheless, even after the warning that Darcy gave her. But people did mention in last week's episode that she seems to be in contact with some sort of scientist. I can't remember the specific science now. It's literally just escaped my head. But people were freaking out like, oh my god, could this be Reed Richards? We don't know who she could potentially be trying to contact, but it is mentioned again here after she expresses that she wants to go back in the dome, that she does have some sort of contact who is on their way. So I'm hoping that in next week's episode we might find out who that was. If it is an introduction to a character like Reed Richards, that would be crazy. Like, that would be crazy. I'm not even the biggest fan of the Fantastic Four, but to have so much going on in this Disney Plus show to the point where we're introducing members of the Fantastic Four, that would be insane. But overall, as per usual, I think this episode did an excellent job of just building up that tension, building up the mystery. It answers some questions, but then leaves us with a bunch more that are unsolved. And that is just what keeps us tuning in week after week. I have to say, I'm still upset by the fact that these episodes are so short. I was shocked when the episode ended with just Wanda's eyes glowing red as she expanded her world. I was like, seriously? Another week that we have to wait until we get answers to that situation? It's painful. It builds up tension like nothing else, but it is so painful nonetheless. And as I said at the beginning of this review, I did also enjoy the kind of 90s references I feel much more familiar with. I saw a lot of, like I said, Malcolm Malcolm in the Middle, but also a sprinkling of Halloween Town. Am I crazy, or did this episode give us a bit of Halloween Town, especially with the pumpkin in the middle of that town square, which is really fun? And also we had that scene where they're coming out of a movie theatre, which was also present in Halloween Town, except this time around we saw that the films that were playing were The Parent Trap and The Incredibles. So again, I really enjoyed the vibe of this episode, and as per usual, I'm just counting down the milliseconds until the next episode so we can find out what happens next. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on WandaVision episode 6, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!